Billionaire offers $27 to an 8-year-old poor girl to give a German speech in public to humiliate her, but her talent amazed everyone. Before we begin, I'm curious. What time is it where you are? Day or night? I'm grateful you're here. Please like this video and follow our channel so you don't miss our future uploads. The crystalline chandeliers of Boston's Blackwell Grand Hall cast a golden glow over the city's elite as they mingled, champagne flutes in hand. Men in crisp tuxedos and women draped in diamonds laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. The annual Winter Charity Gala was in full swing, raising millions for causes that most attendees would forget by morning. Richard Blackwell stood at the center of it all, a glass of 30-year-old Scotch in his manicured hand. At 55, he commanded attention not just through his imposing 6'2" frame, but through the quiet knowledge that he could buy and sell everyone in the room. Twice. "Another successful event, Richard," purred Congressman Williams, clapping him on the shoulder. "You've outdone yourself this year." Richard smiled thinly. Success to him wasn't measured in polite compliments or tax-deductible donations. It was measured in power, the ability to make people bend to his will. And tonight, he was bored. His eyes drifted across the room, past the usual sycophants and social climbers, until they landed on something unexpected. A small figure darting between the catering tables, a child with honey-blonde hair, pulled back in a neat but worn ribbon. She couldn't have been more than 8, wearing a clean but clearly second-hand dress, helping the catering staff. "Who brought a child to my gala?" he asked, interrupting whatever the congressman had been saying. Henry Thompson, Richard's longtime business rival, appeared at his side. "One of the server's daughters, I believe. The mother couldn't find childcare. Apparently she has a sick baby at home too." Richard's eyes narrowed as he watched the little girl, carefully arranging napkins with unexpected precision. "Bring them both to me," he said to his assistant, who scurried off immediately. 5 minutes later, a nervous woman in a catering uniform stood before him, clutching her daughter's hand. The girl looked up at Richard without fear, only curiosity in her clear blue eyes. "You've brought your child to work," Richard stated flatly. The woman paled. "Mr. Blackwell, I'm so sorry. My babysitter cancelled last minute and my little boy is sick. I couldn't leave Emma alone, and I need this job desperately. Please don't fire me." "What's your name?" Richard asked the girl, ignoring the mother's pleas. "Emma Wilson, sir," the child replied with unexpected composure. "I'm 8 years old." Something about her calm demeanor irritated Richard. Children should be intimidated by him. Everyone should be. "Do you speak any foreign languages, Emma?" he asked suddenly, a cruel idea forming. "Yes, sir. I speak German. My Oma taught me before she died." The entire room had gone quiet, the wealthy guests sensing entertainment brewing. Richard's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'll make you a deal, Emma Wilson," he announced loudly. "I'll give you and your mother $27 million if you can give a speech in German right now to this entire room." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even for Richard Blackwell, this was outlandish. "Richard," Henry Thompson stepped forward, frowning. "What are you doing?" "Having fun, Henry," Richard replied without looking at him. "Well, Emma, $27 million, enough to take care of your mother and sick brother forever. All you have to do is speak German to this room for 2 minutes." Sarah Wilson, Emma's mother, stood frozen in horror. "Mr. Blackwell, please." "It's okay, Mommy," Emma said quietly. "I can do it." Richard smirked, already imagining the child's humiliation when she failed. He'd expose the lie, teach her an early lesson about the real world. People like her didn't speak German. People like her didn't have skills worth millions. "The stage is yours," he said, gesturing to the raised platform where the string quartet had been playing. "Dazzle us." As Emma walked toward the stage, her small shoulders squared with determination, None of the glittering audience could have predicted how this cruel challenge would change all their lives forever. Sarah Wilson's hands trembled as she watched her daughter climb the 3 steps to the stage. The past year had been a nightmare. Her husband John walking out after Tommy was born, losing their home, Sarah's illness that left her unable to work for months. Now she cleaned houses by day and served at events by night, while Emma had been forced to grow up too fast. "Stop this," Sarah whispered desperately to Richard Blackwell. "She's just a child." "A child who claims to speak German," Richard replied, amused. "Let's see if she's telling the truth." Henry Thompson moved closer to Sarah. "I'm sorry about this," he murmured. "Richard wasn't always this way." On stage, Emma stood before the microphone, looking impossibly small against the backdrop of glittering decorations. Her worn blue dress was neat but faded, her shoes scuffed but polished. The contrast between her and the opulence surrounding her was jarring. Emma's thoughts drifted to their tiny apartment, where Mrs. Petrovich from next door was watching Tommy. Her baby brother had been crying all day, hungry because they couldn't afford the special formula he needed. The regular kind made him sick, and Sarah's illness had left her unable to breastfeed. The doctor bills were piling up, and the landlord was threatening eviction. Emma thought of her Oma, her grandmother Elise Weber, who had emigrated from Munich decades ago. Until her death last year, Oma had spent hours teaching Emma her mother tongue, telling stories of the old country. "Sprache ist Freiheit," Oma would say. "Language is freedom." Emma took a deep breath and leaned toward the microphone. "Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren," she began, her pronunciation flawless, her voice clear despite her nervousness. "Ich heiße Emma Wilson." Richard Blackwell's smug smile faltered. The child was actually speaking German, not just random words, but with proper inflection and confidence. "Ich bin hier, weil ein Mann dachte, könnte mich demütigen," Emma continued, her voice growing stronger. "He thought he could humiliate me," she translated for the audience. A murmur ran through the crowd. Richard's face darkened. "Aber meine Oma hat mir beigebracht, dass Wissen Macht ist." Emma looked directly at Richard. "My grandmother taught me that knowledge is power." Across the room, Margaret Blackwell, Richard's estranged wife who had arrived late and unnoticed, watched with growing interest. Unlike the others, she understood every word the child was saying, having studied in Berlin in her youth. Emma continued speaking, her German flowing naturally. She told of her little brother, Tommy, just 1 year old, who needed special formula they couldn't afford. She spoke of her mother working 2 jobs after recovering from pneumonia. She described their cold apartment and the kindness of neighbors who helped when they could. "Ich stehe nicht hier für Geld," Emma said, her eyes now glistening with tears. "I'm not here for money." The room was completely silent now. Even the servers had stopped to listen. "Ich möchte nur Milch für meinen kleinen Bruder. Hat Hunger." Emma's voice broke slightly. "I only want milk for my little brother. He is hungry." Sarah covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "Sie können Ihr Geld behalten, Herr Blackwell, aber wenn Sie ein Herz haben, geben Sie den Kindern in dieser Stadt zu essen." Emma's final words hung in the air. "You can keep your money, Mr. Blackwell, but if you have a heart, give the children in this city something to eat." With that, Emma stepped back from the microphone. For 3 heartbeats, the room remained in stunned silence. Then, from the back, a slow clap began. Margaret Blackwell stepped forward, applauding with tears in her eyes. One by one, others joined until the entire room erupted in applause and cheers. All except Richard Blackwell, whose face had turned to stone as his cruel game backfired spectacularly. Emma stepped down from the stage and ran to her mother's arms, unaware that her simple speech had just set in motion events that would change everything. Doctor. James Carter was halfway through his nightly rounds at Boston Children's Hospital when his phone rang. The pediatrician recognized Sarah Wilson's number immediately. He'd been treating her one-year-old son pro bono for months, concerned about the baby's failure to thrive. "Sarah, is Tommy worse?" he asked without preamble. "It's not that, Doctor." "Carter?" Sarah's voice sounded strange, breathless, disbelieving. Something's happened, something impossible. As Sarah recounted the events at the Blackwell Gala, Dr. Carter sat heavily in his office chair. He'd known Emma since she was born, a bright, resilient child who'd shouldered responsibilities no 8-year-old should bear. "He actually offered $27 million, Dr. Carter asked incredulously, and Emma gave a speech in German. "Perfect German," Sarah confirmed. "James, the whole room was in tears, everyone except Blackwell himself. He looked furious." Dr. Carter's concern deepened. Richard Blackwell wasn't known for taking public embarrassment well. "Sarah, be careful. Men like Blackwell don't make offers like that without being absolutely certain they'll never have to pay." "That's just it," Sarah said. "After Emma finished, Blackwell disappeared. His assistant gave me this." She held up a business card, though Dr. Carter couldn't see it. "We're supposed to meet at his lawyer's office tomorrow morning." "I'm coming with you," Dr. Carter said firmly. "Don't go alone." After hanging up, the doctor's thoughts turned to little Tommy, currently admitted to the malnutrition ward. The specialized formula the baby needed cost more than Sarah could afford on her meager income. If Blackwell actually paid, Dr. Carter shook his head. Men like Richard Blackwell didn't give away millions because of a child's speech, no matter how moving. Meanwhile, across town, Richard Blackwell slammed his office door and poured himself another scotch. The humiliation burned worse than the alcohol. The child had made him look like a fool, worse, a heartless monster, in front of Boston's elite. "You should pay her," came a voice from the shadowed corner of his office. Richard whirled around to find his estranged wife, Margaret, sitting calmly in his leather armchair. They hadn't spoken directly in months, communicating only through lawyers as their divorce proceedings dragged on. "How did you get in here?" he demanded. "I still have keys, Richard," Margaret replied coolly. "And I'm still on the board of Blackwell Enterprises, despite your best efforts," Richard scowled. "I'm not paying that child $27 million. "Yes, you are," Margaret said, standing. At 53, she remained elegant and commanding, her silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a chignon. "Because if you don't, I'll ensure every newspaper and television station knows exactly what happened tonight. How Boston's wealthiest man tried to humiliate an 8-year-old girl and was instead shown what true dignity looks like. You wouldn't dare. Watch me." Margaret moved toward the door. "You've become everything your father was, Richard. I remember when that would have been your worst nightmare." After she left, Richard stared into his glass, unwelcome memories surfacing. His own childhood in South Boston, before his father struck it rich. The taunts, the hunger, the shame. He'd buried that boy so deeply he sometimes forgot he had ever existed. But now that forgotten child's voice whispered in his mind, "You became the bully you once hated." Richard silenced it with another drink. Across the city in their cramped apartment, Emma sat beside Tommy's empty crib, singing a German lullaby her Oma had taught her. Sarah had called their elderly neighbor to check on Tommy, learning that the baby was fussier than usual, his formula nearly gone. "Do you think he'll really give us the money, Mommy?" Emma asked as Sarah hung up the phone. Sarah sat beside her daughter, pulling her close. "I don't know, sweetheart. But what you did tonight was brave and beautiful. No matter what happens tomorrow, I want you to remember that." Emma nodded, but her mind was on Tommy. If they had the money, her brother would never go hungry again. Her mother wouldn't have to work herself to exhaustion. They could have a home with heat that worked properly and no mold on the bathroom ceiling. "Mommy," Emma said suddenly, "why would Mr. Blackwell offer so much money? Why $27 million? Sarah had been wondering the same thing. The number seemed oddly specific. "I don't know," she admitted, "but we'll find out tomorrow." Die. What neither of them knew was that 27 had been Richard Blackwell's age when he made his first million, the age when he'd finally felt he'd escaped his impoverished past. The number had been deliberate, though even Richard himself didn't fully understand why he'd chosen it. As midnight approached, 4 people lay awake across Boston. Sarah, worried about the meeting to come. Emma, dreaming of a better life for her family. Richard, wrestling with unwanted memories. And Margaret, formulating a plan to ensure her husband honored his cruel bargain. None of them realized that Tommy's condition was worsening by the hour, or that by morning everything would change again. The offices of Harrington and Pierce occupied the 32nd floor of a sleek downtown tower with panoramic views of Boston Harbor. Sarah Wilson clutched Emma's hand as they rode the elevator up, both dressed in their Sunday best, which for Sarah meant a 10-year-old navy skirt suit, and for Emma, the same dress she'd worn to the gala, freshly washed and pressed. Dr. Carter stood beside them, a reassuring presence in his tweed jacket and bow tie. That morning, he'd called the hospital to check on Tommy, who had been admitted overnight when Mrs. Petrovich noticed his breathing had become labored. The baby was stable but weak, his tiny body fighting malnutrition and what appeared to be a developing respiratory infection. "Remember, Doctor," Carter murmured as the elevator climbed, "don't sign anything without reading it carefully. Men like Blackwell always have angles." The elevator doors opened directly into a reception area where a poised young woman sat behind a marble desk. "Miss Wilson, Mr. Blackwell is expecting you." Her eyes flickered to Dr. Carter. "I'm afraid he only mentioned 2 visitors." "Dr. Carter is our friend," Emma said, before her mother could respond. "He takes care of Tommy when he's sick." Something in the child's direct gaze made the receptionist hesitate. "One moment," she said, picking up her phone. While they waited, Emma wandered to the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out at the city below. Somewhere out there was Tommy in his hospital bed. She placed her palm against the cold glass. "Hang on, Tommy," she whispered. "I'm getting help." "They'll see all of you now," the receptionist announced, leading them down a hallway to a massive conference room where Richard Blackwell sat at the head of a long table, flanked by 3 attorneys. To Sarah's surprise, Margaret Blackwell was also present, sitting apart from her husband, with a legal pad before her. Richard did not stand when they entered. "Ms. Wilson, Emma." His gaze settled on Dr. Carter. "I don't believe we've been introduced." "Dr. James Carter, pediatrician," Carter replied, extending his hand, which Richard ignored. "I've been treating the Wilson family for years." "Shall we get to the point?" Richard said coldly. "I'm a busy man." And one of the attorneys, a severe-looking woman with steel-grey hair, slid a document across the table. "This is our offer, Ms. Wilson, $500,000, contingent upon a complete non-disclosure agreement regarding last night's events." "500,000?" Dr. Carter echoed incredulously. "The offer was $27 million. An obviously hyperbolic statement made in jest," the attorney replied smoothly. "No reasonable person would consider it a binding offer." Sarah stared at the document, her hope crumbling. Even 500,000 would change their lives, but after the night they'd had, after the way Emma had moved an entire room to tears, this felt like another humiliation. "You're trying to cheat them," Margaret Blackwell said quietly. Richard's jaw tightened. "Stay out of this, Margaret." "I recorded the entire exchange last night, Richard." Margaret held up her phone. "Every word, including your very specific offer of $27 million if Emma gave a speech in German, which she did, beautifully." Emma, who had been silent, stepped forward. "My brother is in the hospital," she said, looking directly at Richard. "He needs special formula and medicine. I did what you asked." "I wasn't even scared." Richard wouldn't meet her eyes. Business deals involve negotiation. I'm offering a fair settlement. Fair? Dr. Carter scoffed. You publicly challenged a child, assuming she would fail. When she succeeded, you're trying to renege. Where I come from, that's called welching on a bet. Richard flushed darkly at the accusation. If there was one thing his father had taught him, it was that a Blackwell never welched on a bet. It was a matter of honor, perhaps the only matter of honor his gambling-addicted father had respected. Before Richard could respond, his phone rang. Glancing at the screen, he frowned. "Excuse me," he said, stepping out of the room. In the momentary quiet, Margaret moved to sit beside Sarah. "I'm sorry about this," she said softly. "Richard wasn't always like this. There was a time when he would have been the first to help a child in need." Sarah looked at the elegant woman with surprise. What happened to him? Margaret sighed. Success, isolation, forgetting where he came from. She glanced at the door. "But I don't think he's beyond redemption. Not yet." The door opened and Richard returned, his face ashen. "The meeting is adjourned," he announced abruptly. "We'll reconvene tomorrow." "Mr. Blackwell," Sarah began to protest, but he cut her off. "Your son has been moved to intensive care," he said flatly. "Respiratory failure. They're asking for family to come immediately." Sarah gasped, grabbing Emma's hand. "Tommy, we have to go." "My car is downstairs," Richard said, surprising everyone. "It will get you through traffic faster than a taxi." As they rushed toward the elevator, Emma looked back at Richard. For a brief moment their eyes met, and something passed between them. A recognition, perhaps, or a challenge. Then the elevator doors closed, and they were descending toward an uncertain future, while Richard remained behind, surrounded by his wealth and the ghosts of his past. The pediatric intensive care unit at Boston Children's Hospital was a world of hushed voices and gentle beeping monitors. Sarah rushed through the sliding doors with Emma at her side, Dr. Carter following close behind. Richard Blackwell's driver had indeed gotten them through traffic in record time, though the man himself had not accompanied them. "Tommy Wilson," Sarah gasped to the nurse at the station. "I'm his mother." The nurse nodded gravely. "The doctor will be right with you. You can go in and see him." Tommy lay in a clear-sided crib, tubes and wires connecting his tiny body to various machines. His skin had a greyish tinge, and each breath seemed to require tremendous effort. Sarah covered her mouth to stifle a sob as she rushed to his side. Emma stood frozen in the doorway. Her little brother looked so small, so fragile. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. Mr. Blackwell was supposed to give them the money, and Tommy was supposed to get better. Everything was going wrong. Doctor Lisa Chen, the attending physician, entered behind them. "Mrs. Wilson, we've started him on antibiotics for pneumonia, but he's severely malnourished, which is complicating his ability to fight the infection." "It's Ms." Sarah corrected automatically. "His father isn't in the picture." "And I've been trying. The special formula he needs is so expensive." Dr. Chen nodded sympathetically. "I understand. Dr. Carter has filled us in on Tommy's history. We're doing everything we can." Emma tugged at Dr. Carter's sleeve. "Is Tommy going to die?" she whispered. Dr. Carter knelt to her level. "Not if we can help it, Emma. The doctors here are the best in the country." He didn't add what he was thinking, that Tommy's condition was indeed critical, and that the next 24 hours would be decisive. As Sarah spoke with Dr. Chen about treatment options, Emma slipped away to the window overlooking the city. In the distance, she could see the gleaming tower where they'd met with Mr. Blackwell that morning. Anger bubbled up inside her, a feeling she wasn't accustomed to. "It's not fair," she whispered, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. "He promised." "Emma?" A voice behind her made her turn. Margaret Blackwell stood in the doorway, elegant in a cashmere coat, holding a large gift bag. "May I come in?" Emma nodded silently. Margaret approached Tommy's crib, her expression softening as she looked at the baby. "I've brought some things," she said to Sarah. "The formula the doctor recommended, enough for a month. And some clothes for Tommy when he's better." Sarah looked up in surprise. "Thank you, but why?" Margaret set the bag down. "Because it's the right thing to do." She hesitated. "And because I want you to know that not all Blackwells are like Richard." Dr. Carter entered, having stepped out to consult with colleagues. His eyebrows rose at the sight of Margaret. "Mrs. Blackwell?" "Dr. Carter." Margaret nodded. "I'd like to speak with you privately, if I may." As they stepped into the hallway, Emma moved to her brother's crib. Tommy's eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused and glassy with fever. Emma reached through the side of the crib to touch his small hand. "Ich bin hier, kleiner Bruder," she whispered. "I'm here, little brother. I won't let anything bad happen to you." In the hallway, Margaret was speaking intently to Dr. Carter. "Richard's behavior has been inexcusable, but there's something you should know. 27 years ago, Richard's younger brother died of pneumonia complicated by malnutrition. Their father had gambled away everything, and they couldn't afford proper medical care." Dr. Carter's eyes widened. "I had no idea." "Few people do. Richard reinvented himself completely after he made his fortune. He never speaks of his past." Margaret looked through the window at Tommy's crib. "But seeing that baby, I think it's bringing back memories he spent decades trying to forget." Inside the room, Sarah noticed a folded paper that had fallen from Margaret's gift bag. Opening it, she found a cashier's check for $1 million made out to Sarah Wilson. Her hands trembled as she read the accompanying note. "This is not charity. It's payment for Emma's performance. The rest will come when Richard remembers who he really is. MB." Sarah looked up as Margaret re-entered the room. "I can't accept this," she said, holding out the check. "You can and you will," Margaret replied firmly. "Not for yourself, but for your children, especially for Tommy, who needs specialized care." Emma, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "Is Mr. Blackwell a bad person?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "No, Emma. He's a person who forgot who he was. Sometimes that's the most dangerous thing that can happen to anyone." A commotion in the hallway drew their attention. Richard Blackwell himself stood at the nurses' station arguing with the staff. "I don't care about your policies," his voice carried clearly. "I'm paying for a private room and the best specialists you have." Emma's eyes widened. Sarah clutched the check, uncertain. "Doctor." Carter and Margaret exchanged glances. As Richard turned toward Tommy's room, his eyes locked with Emma's through the glass. For the briefest moment, the hardness in his expression faltered, revealing something else entirely. Something raw and painful that vanished so quickly, Emma thought she might have imagined it. The battle for Tommy's life, and perhaps for Richard Blackwell's soul, was just beginning. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of doctors' consultations, tests, and anxious waiting. Tommy remained in critical condition, though the specialized care he now received, courtesy of Richard Blackwell's intervention, was making a difference. The best pediatric pulmonologist in New England had been flown in from Vermont, and a nutritional specialist monitored Tommy's feeding schedule. Through it all, Richard Blackwell remained a contradictory presence. He had commandeered a conference room near the PSU, converting it into a makeshift office from which he ran his business empire, while periodically checking on Tommy's condition. He barely spoke to Sarah or Emma, communicating primarily through his assistant or hospital staff. "I don't understand him," Sarah confessed to Dr. Carter, as they sat in the family waiting area while Emma napped on a nearby couch. "He's paying for everything. The best doctors, private nurses, even had this waiting area renovated overnight for families. But he can barely look at us." Dr. Carter glanced toward the conference room, where Richard could be seen through the glass, barking orders into his phone. "Margaret told me about Richard's brother. he said quietly. I think seeing Tommy is forcing him to confront memories he spent a lifetime burying. Boom, on the afternoon of the third day, Emma woke from her nap and slipped away while her mother dozed in a chair. She had a mission. Following the signs through the hospital corridors, she made her way to Richard's makeshift office. His assistant, a harried-looking young man, was just leaving with an empty coffee cup. Emma seized her chance and pushed open the door without knocking. Richard looked up from his laptop, startled. "Emma? Where's your mother?" "Sleeping." Emma closed the door behind her and approached his desk with determined steps. "I need to talk to you." Something in her serious expression made Richard set aside his work. "All right. What about?" Emma climbed onto the chair across from him. "Why did you offer $27 million? The directness of the question caught Richard off guard. Most adults in his life tiptoed around him, afraid of his temper or his power. This child showed no such fear. "It was an arbitrary number," he lied. Emma shook her head. "No, it wasn't. Mrs. Blackwell told Dr. Carter about your brother, the one who died when you were 27. Richard's face drained of color. "Margaret had no right." "Was his name Tommy too?" Emma pressed. "Thomas," Richard corrected automatically, then looked as if he regretted speaking. After a long pause, he continued, "My brother was Thomas. Everyone called him Tommy." Emma nodded, as if confirming a suspicion. "That's why you're helping my Tommy, even though you're still mad about the speech." Richard stared at her, this child who saw through him with unnerving clarity. "I'm not mad about the speech," he said finally. "I'm uncomfortable with what it revealed." "About you being mean?" Despite himself, Richard's lips twitched. "Among other things." Emma reached into her pocket and pulled out a worn photograph. "This is my Oma, my grandmother. She taught me German." She slid the photo across the desk. Richard picked it up. An elderly woman with Emma's blue eyes smiled at the camera, her arm around a younger Emma. "She died last year," Emma continued. "She always said we should be kind even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Richard handed the photo back, something shifting behind his eyes. "Your grandmother sounds wise." She was. Emma took the photo carefully. "She also said people who are mean are usually just sad or scared inside." Richard's jaw tightened. "I'm neither sad nor scared, Emma." "Okay," Emma shrugged, unconvinced. "But you still owe us $27 million. The bluntness startled a genuine laugh from Richard, a sound his assistant passing by the door hadn't heard in months. "You don't give up, do you?" Richard asked, studying her. "Not when it's important," Emma replied seriously. "And Tommy is important." Before Richard could respond, a code alarm blared through the hospital speakers. "Code Blue, Pediatric ICU. Code Blue, Pediatric ICU." Emma's face went white. "Tommy!" She bolted from the chair toward the door. Richard was on his feet instantly, all pretense of detachment gone. "Stay with me," he ordered, taking her hand as they rushed through the corridors. They arrived at the PICU to find organized chaos. Doctors and nurses surrounding Tommy's crib, Sarah held back by a nurse, her face contorted in anguish. "Mommy!" Emma broke free from Richard, running to her mother. Richard stood frozen in the doorway, another hospital room superimposing itself in his memory, his father passed out drunk in the waiting area, his mother weeping, and 17-year-old Richard watching helplessly as doctors tried to save his 10-year-old brother. The sounds, the smells, the terrible helplessness all came rushing back. "Mr. Blackwell?" Dr. Chen appeared at his side. "We need your authorization. There's an experimental treatment, not fully covered by insurance." "Do it," Richard cut her off. "Do everything. Price is no object." As the medical team worked, Richard found himself standing beside Sarah and Emma, the three of them united in their vigil. Without thinking, he placed a steady hand on Sarah's shoulder. "He'll make it," Richard said with a certainty he didn't feel. "Tommy's a fighter." And in that moment, something shifted, a wall crumbling inside the fortress Richard had built around himself. This time, when Emma's tear-filled eyes met his, he didn't look away. Hours passed, like years, as Tommy fought for his life. The experimental treatment Dr. Chen had recommended was a specialized respiratory therapy paired with an innovative nutritional protocol. Sarah remained by the crib, whispering prayers while Emma sat nearby, unusually still and silent. Richard paced the hallway, making calls to bring in additional specialists. The hospital staff watched with astonishment as Boston's most notorious businessman threw his considerable influence behind saving one small child. "His oxygen levels are stabilizing," Dr. Chen announced finally, checking the monitors. "We're not out of the woods, but he's responding to treatment." A collective exhale filled the room. Sarah collapsed into a chair, overcome with relief. Emma slipped her small hand into her mother's. "See, Mommy? I told you he'd be okay." Richard, who had paused his pacing at the doctor's words, felt something loosen in his chest, a tightness he hadn't realized was there. The image of another hospital room, another little boy who hadn't been so fortunate, began to recede. Margaret arrived shortly after, carrying coffee for everyone. She handed a cup to Richard, their fingers brushing momentarily. "You're doing the right thing," she said quietly. Richard accepted the coffee without reply, but the hostility that had characterized their recent interactions was noticeably absent. As midnight approached, Dr. Carter convinced Sarah to get some proper rest in the nearby hotel where Richard had arranged rooms for them. Emma, however, refused to leave. "I promised Tommy I'd stay," she insisted. To everyone's surprise, Richard spoke up. "I'll stay with them. I have calls to make anyway." After Sarah reluctantly departed with Dr. Carter, an awkward silence fell between Richard and Emma. The little girl climbed into the recliner beside Tommy's crib, her determined gaze fixed on her brother's sleeping face. "You should sleep too," Richard said, settling into a chair with his laptop. "Can't," Emma replied simply. "I'm the big sister." Something about her solemn dedication struck Richard. "I was a big brother too," he found himself saying. Emma looked up. "To Tommy. Thomas." Richard nodded, surprising himself by continuing. "He was 10 when he got sick. I was 17. What was he like?" Emma asked. Richard stared at his laptop screen without seeing it. When was the last time anyone had asked him about Tommy? When was the last time he'd allowed himself to remember? He was smart, funny, always asking questions that drove our parents crazy. A ghost of a smile touched Richard's lips. He wanted to be a pilot. "My Tommy likes airplanes too," Emma said. "I show him pictures in books." Richard's gaze drifted to the sleeping infant, his chest now rising and falling more steadily. "The night my brother died, I promised him I'd become rich enough to make sure no one in our family would ever go without medical care again. Did you keep your promise?" "Yes, but somewhere along the way I forgot why I made it." Emma considered this. "Maybe Tommy reminded you." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock. Henry Thompson, Richard's business rival from the gala, stood in the doorway. "Margaret called me," Henry explained. "Thought you could use a friend." Richard's initial impulse was to send Henry away, but instead he gestured to the empty chair. "It's going to be a long night." As the two men settled into a quiet conversation about business matters, neutral territory, Emma finally drifted to sleep in her chair. Richard noticed and silently removed his cashmere coat, draping it over her small form. Henry observed the gesture with interest. "I didn't know you had a soft spot for kids, Richard." "I don't," Richard replied automatically. But as he watched Emma sleeping peacefully beside her brother's crib, protected by his coat that engulfed her like a blanket, he wasn't so certain anymore. Dawn was breaking over Boston when Tommy opened his eyes, truly alert for the first time in days. His searching gaze found Emma, still asleep under Richard's coat. "Look at that," Henry murmured. "The little fighter made it through." Richard moved to the crib, studying the baby's face. Tommy's eyes, blue like Emma's, locked onto Richard's, and a tiny hand reached upward. Without thinking, Richard extended his finger. Tommy grasped it with surprising strength, and something inside Richard Blackwell changed forever. By the end of the week, Tommy had improved enough to be moved out of intensive care. The specialized formula and treatments were working, though doctors warned he would need ongoing care. Sarah alternated between overwhelming gratitude and nagging anxiety about mounting costs, despite Richard's assurances that everything was covered. "I can't be in your debt forever," Sarah told Richard as they sat in the hospital cafeteria while Emma entertained Tommy in his new room. "This arrangement can't last indefinitely." Richard studied his coffee. Since the night of Tommy's crisis, he'd been different, quieter, more thoughtful. The ruthless businessman was still there, as his staff could attest, but something else had emerged alongside it. "Have you deposited Margaret's check?" he asked. Sarah nodded. "It felt wrong, but Emma's school needs new uniforms, and our apartment—" "It's not enough," Richard interrupted. $1 million sounds like a lot, but with medical expenses and education costs for both children." He hesitated. "The original offer stands." Sarah stared at him. $27 million? You can't be serious." "I'm always serious about money, Ms. Wilson." "Sarah," she corrected automatically, "and this isn't about money anymore, is it?" Before Richard could respond, his phone rang, his attorney calling for the third time that day. With a muttered excuse, he stepped away to answer. "The board is questioning these hospital expenditures," the lawyer informed him without preamble, "and there's talk about your judgment being compromised. Thompson is rallying support." Richard's jaw tightened. Henry's friendly appearance at the hospital had apparently been reconnaissance. "Schedule an emergency board meeting for Monday. And draw up those papers we discussed." Returning to Sarah, he found her watching him with concern. "Problems?" "Nothing I can't handle," Richard replied dismissively. "We should discuss Emma's education. Boston Prep has an excellent program." "Richard," Sarah interrupted gently, "why are you doing all this, really?" The question hung between them. In the week since Tommy's crisis, they developed an odd companionship born of shared vigils and mutual concern for the children, but they'd carefully avoided addressing the deeper questions. "Because Emma fulfilled her end of the bargain," Richard said finally, "and a Blackwell always pays his debts." Sarah clearly didn't believe this was the whole truth, but she let it pass. "Emma wants to see you. She has something to show you." They found Emma sitting beside Tommy's crib, reading a children's book in German. The baby gurgled happily at the sound of his sister's voice. "Mr. Blackwell!" Emma exclaimed when she saw him. "Look what Mrs. Blackwell brought me." She held up a leather-bound notebook. "It's a journal for writing stories. I wrote one about Tommy." She hesitated. "And about your Tommy, too." Richard stiffened. "You wrote about my brother?" Emma nodded solemnly. "It's a story about two Tommies who are friends in heaven, but one Tommy gets to come back because his big sister needs him." Sarah touched her daughter's shoulder. "Emma, Mr. Blackwell might not want—" "May I read it?" Richard asked, surprising everyone, including himself. As Emma proudly handed over her notebook, a nurse appeared with medication for Tommy. Sarah moved to help, leaving Richard and Emma alone with the story. Richard sat in the visitor's chair and began to read Emma's childish handwriting. The story was simple but haunting. A conversation between two boys named Tommy, one explaining to the other that he had to return to his sister who was very brave but needed him. The angel said only one Tommy could go back, Emma had written. So the older Tommy said he would stay so the baby Tommy could return. Richard's vision blurred. He hadn't cried since the night his brother died, but now he felt dangerously close. "Do you like it?" Emma asked anxiously. Richard cleared his throat. "It's very good, Emma. You're a talented writer." Emma beamed. "Mrs. Blackwell says I should write a book someday. She said you could publish it because you own a big company." "I'd be honored," Richard replied, and was startled to realize he meant it. The boardroom of Blackwell Enterprises fell silent as Richard entered, followed by his team of lawyers. The Monday morning emergency meeting had drawn every board member, including Margaret, who sat apart from the others, her expression unreadable. Henry Thompson rose to speak first. "Richard, we're concerned about recent decisions you've made regarding the Wilson family, specifically the unlimited medical fund you've established and rumors of a substantial payment." Richard surveyed the room coolly. These were people who had never questioned his ruthlessness before, indeed had profited handsomely from it. Now they worried he'd gone soft. "My personal expenditures are not board business," he replied. "The company's quarterly projections remain unchanged." "It becomes board business," Henry countered, "when your judgment appears compromised. Witnesses at the gala report you offered $27 million to a child. Now you're paying for experimental treatments and talking about establishing an educational trust." Several board members shifted uncomfortably. Richard noted who looked sympathetic and who seemed aligned with Henry. The lines were being drawn. "If I choose to honor a commitment, that reflects integrity, not compromised judgment," Richard said evenly. "It's more than that," Henry pressed. "You've been at the hospital daily. Your assistant says you've cancelled 3 major meetings. This, attachment to the Wilson family, is affecting operations." Margaret spoke up unexpectedly. "I believe what my husband does with his personal fortune is his decision alone. Unless there's evidence of fiduciary irresponsibility toward shareholders, this discussion is inappropriate." Richard glanced at her, surprised by the support. Their eyes met briefly, an old connection flickering beneath years of estrangement. "Nevertheless," Henry continued, "we've prepared a motion requiring board approval for any personal expenditure exceeding $5 million. Richard smiled thinly. "Interesting timing, Henry. Just as the Westbrook acquisition is on the table, an acquisition you opposed and stand to lose substantially on." Henry flushed. "This isn't about Westbrook, isn't it?" Richard opened a folder his attorney handed him. "Before we vote on your motion, I should inform the board that I've purchased an additional 12% of company shares on the open market. Combined with Margaret's holdings, we now control 57%. The room erupted in murmurs. Richard continued calmly. "I've also prepared documentation showing communications between Mr. Thompson and Westbrook competitors, suggesting conflicts of interest that should concern us all." By meeting's end, Henry Thompson had resigned from the board. Richard's authority was reaffirmed, and the Westbrook acquisition was unanimously approved. Business as usual at Blackwell Enterprises, except it wasn't quite business as usual. As the boardroom emptied, Margaret lingered. "That was impressive," she noted, "though ruthless as ever." Richard gathered his papers. "Business and personal matters remain separate." Thompson crossed a line. "And what about us?" Margaret asked quietly. "We've been separated for nearly a year, divorce proceedings crawling along. Yet today we voted as a bloc." Richard hesitated. The truth was, seeing Margaret at the hospital with Emma, bringing journals and encouragement, had reminded him of the woman he'd fallen in love with decades ago. Before success had hardened him, before they'd grown apart. "I've been thinking about Tommy," he said finally. "My brother, I mean. Things I haven't allowed myself to remember for years." Margaret's expression softened. The Wilson children have awakened something in you. Perhaps. Richard checked his watch. I'm heading to the hospital now. Tommy's being discharged today. Sarah's found a new apartment with the money you gave her, but it will need work to be suitable for a recovering child. Would you like company? Margaret asked. The question hung between them, an olive branch, a possibility. Yes, Richard said after a moment. I think I would. They rode to the hospital in Richard's car, discussing practical matters, the Wilsons' needs, Tommy's ongoing care, Emma's education. It was the longest civil conversation they'd had in months. At the hospital, they found an unexpected scene. Dr. Carter was arguing with a man in the hallway outside Tommy's room, a disheveled man whose loud voice carried clearly. I have every right to see my son, the man insisted. You can't keep me away from my own kids. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face pale. John, please leave. You haven't been part of their lives for over a year. Richard and Margaret exchanged glances. John Wilson, the absent father, had returned. John Wilson's unexpected appearance created immediate chaos. Emma, hearing her father's voice, had hidden in the bathroom with Tommy, locking the door while hospital security was called. You've got some nerve showing up now, Sarah said, her voice shaking with anger. Where were you when Tommy was starving because we couldn't afford his formula? Where were you during his surgeries? John ran a hand through his unkempt hair. I saw the story in the paper. Boston millionaire saves poor kids. Didn't take you long to find a replacement, did it? Richard stepped forward, placing himself between Sarah and her ex-husband. Mr. Wilson, I presume? I'm Richard Blackwell. John sneered. The rich savior himself. You enjoying playing daddy to my kids? Your children are receiving the care they deserve, Richard replied coldly. Care you failed to provide. Security officers arrived, but John wasn't finished. I know all about you, Blackwell. Looked you up. Came from nothing, didn't you? Just like me. Difference is, you got lucky. Something dangerous flashed in Richard's eyes. Luck had nothing to do with it. I worked while men like you walked away from responsibilities. You don't know anything about me, John spat. I know enough, Richard replied. Now you have two choices, leave voluntarily or be escorted out and served with a restraining order by morning. After security removed a still protesting John, Margaret coaxed Emma and Tommy out of the bathroom. The little girl was visibly shaken, holding her brother protectively. Is he gone? Emma whispered. Yes, sweetheart, Sarah assured her, taking Tommy. He won't bother us again. Richard stepped into the hallway to make a call, his voice low and urgent. Margaret followed. What are you doing? She asked. Ensuring Wilson stays away, Richard replied. My security team will keep an eye on him. Margaret studied her husband. This is more than repaying a debt now, isn't it? Richard didn't answer directly. I told Emma once that a Blackwell always pays his debts, but there's another family saying my father had, before he gambled everything away. A Blackwell protects his own. And you consider them your own now? Margaret asked gently. Richard looked through the doorway where Sarah was soothing both children, her face tired but determined. I'm not sure what I consider them, but I know they won't face any more hardship if I can help it. Tommy's discharge proceeded despite the disruption. The new apartment Sarah had found was in a safer neighborhood, but as they arrived to inspect it before bringing Tommy home, it became clear that significant work would be needed to make it truly suitable. The heating system needs updating, Richard noted, examining the radiators, and these windows aren't properly sealed. The air quality would be problematic for Tommy's lungs. Sarah's face fell, but the realtor said it was move-in ready. It's ready by minimal standards, Margaret explained kindly, not medical ones. Richard made another call. Within an hour, contractors were measuring windows and examining the heating system. By evening, a full renovation plan was in place, with work to begin immediately. "Where will we stay until it's finished?" Sarah asked, overwhelmed by the sudden flurry of activity. "I've arranged a suite at the Beacon," Richard replied. "It's near the hospital, and they have excellent room service." As they left the apartment, Emma tugged at Richard's sleeve. "Can we go back to the hospital first? I left my journal there." At the hospital, while Sarah completed Tommy's discharge paperwork, Richard accompanied Emma to retrieve her journal. They found it had fallen behind the bedside table. As Richard reached for it, a folded paper slipped out, a photograph. He handed the journal to Emma, then picked up the photo. It showed a young woman holding a baby, standing in front of a modest house. He was about to return it when something caught his eye. The house looked strangely familiar. "Emma, where did you get this picture?" "It was in Oma's things after she died," Emma explained. "That's Oma when she was young, with my mum when she was a baby." Richard stared at the image, recognition dawning. "This house, this was in South Boston, Haverhill Street." Emma looked surprised. "Yes, that's where Oma lived when Mom was little. How did you know?" Richard's hand trembled slightly. "Because my family lived 3 doors down. This house belonged to the Webbers." Emma's eyes widened. "Weber was Oma's name before she married Grandpa Wilson." The realization struck Richard like a physical blow. Elise Weber, Emma's grandmother, had been his family's neighbor during his childhood. The kind German woman who had sometimes watched Tommy when their parents were working, or when their father was too drunk to care for his children. "Your Oma," Richard said slowly, "once saved my brother's life when he had an asthma attack. She called the ambulance and stayed with him until our parents came home." Emma looked at him with wonder. "So you knew Oma?" "I did," Richard replied softly. "A lifetime ago." The renovation of Sarah's new apartment proceeded at remarkable speed, with crews working around the clock. Meanwhile, the Wilson family settled into their hotel suite, Tommy growing stronger each day with proper nutrition and care. Richard found himself visiting daily, ostensibly to check on Tommy's progress, but increasingly drawn to the warm family dynamic he observed. Emma would read stories to her brother, often in German, while Sarah prepared simple meals in the suite's kitchenette, refusing the room service Richard had arranged. "We need to maintain some normalcy," she explained, "and some independence." One evening, Richard arrived to find Margaret already there, helping Emma with a writing project. The sight of his estranged wife laughing with the little girl gave him pause. When had he last heard Margaret laugh? "The apartment will be ready by Friday," Richard announced, setting down his briefcase. "The medical equipment has been installed, and the air filtration system exceeds hospital standards." "You've thought of everything," Sarah said, a note of something complex in her voice, gratitude mixed with unease. After dinner, while Sarah bathed Tommy, Richard found himself alone with Emma in the suite's living area. The girl was unusually quiet, drawing in her journal. "What are you thinking about?" Richard asked. Emma looked up. "What happens when Tommy gets all better? Will you still visit us?" The question caught Richard off guard. I suppose that depends on what your mother wants." "She likes when you visit," Emma said matter-of-factly. "She smiles more." Richard cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Emma, I've been meaning to ask you something. The night at the gala, when you gave your speech in German, you asked for milk for Tommy. Not money or a home or anything else, just milk for your brother." Emma nodded. "That's what we needed most." Most people would have asked for more. Emma considered this. "Oma always said to ask for what you need, not what you want. Tommy needed milk. I needed Tommy to be okay." She paused. "What do you need, Mr. Blackwell?" Indeed, the simple question struck Richard to his core. What did he need? He had wealth beyond measure, power, influence. Yet sitting in this hotel suite with this remarkable child, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, a sense of purpose beyond accumulation and control. Before he could formulate an answer, Sarah returned with Tommy. The baby was alert and lively, reaching for Richard as soon as he saw him, a reaction that still surprised Richard each time it happened. Almost without thinking, Richard took Tommy in his arms. The baby grabbed his tie with pudgy fingers, gurgling happily. "He's much stronger," Richard observed, bouncing Tommy gently. "The new treatment protocol is working." Sarah watched them, her expression softening. "Dr. Carter says he's making remarkable progress. He might not need the supplemental oxygen at all in another month." The peaceful moment was shattered by Richard's phone ringing. Balancing Tommy with one arm, he answered with the other. "Blackwell!" His expression darkened as he listened. "When? Are you certain?" Another pause. "Keep them there. I'm coming now." He handed Tommy back to Sarah. "I have to go. There's been a security incident at your apartment." "What kind of incident?" Sarah asked, alarmed. "John Wilson tried to break in," Richard replied grimly. "My security team apprehended him. The police are on their way." Sarah paled. "What did he want? We'll find out." Richard gathered his coat. "Stay here. I'll handle this." "No," Sarah said firmly. "These are my children and my ex-husband. I'm coming with you." After arranging for Margaret to stay with the children, Richard and Sarah drove to the apartment in tense silence. When they arrived, they found John handcuffed and seated in a security vehicle, 2 officers taking statements. "He had these on him," the head of security informed Richard, holding up a plastic evidence bag containing what appeared to be legal documents. John saw Sarah and called out, "They have no right to keep me from my kids. I'm their father." Sarah approached the vehicle, Richard at her side. "What do you want, John, really?" John glared at Richard. "I want what's mine, my kids, and a share of whatever he's giving you." The officer handed Sarah the documents from the evidence bag. "Appears to be custody papers, ma'am, and something about financial claims." Sarah scanned the papers, her face hardening. "You abandoned us when Tommy was 3 months old. You've provided no support. Now you think you can come back and claim them because there's money involved?" "I made mistakes," John muttered. "I'm still their father." Richard stepped forward. "Mr. Wilson, I'm prepared to offer you a one-time settlement. In exchange, you'll relinquish all parental rights and claims and agree to no further contact." John's eyes narrowed calculatingly. "How much?" Richard named a figure that made both John and Sarah gasp. "Richard, no," Sarah protested. "He doesn't deserve—" "It's not about deserving," Richard interrupted quietly. "It's about securing Emma and Tommy's future without this hanging over them." As the police took John away to be processed for trespassing and attempted breaking and entering, Richard turned to Sarah. "I'm sorry. I should have anticipated this." Sarah looked at him, really looked at him. "Why are you doing all this, Richard? It can't just be about Emma's speech anymore." Richard gazed at the apartment building where workers continued renovations, even at this late hour. "Emma asked me earlier what I need," he said finally. "I've been thinking about it. For 30 years, I've been trying to outrun the past, the poverty, the helplessness, watching my brother die. I built walls around myself, became someone else entirely." He turned back to Sarah. "Then Emma spoke in German about her hungry brother and something cracked. Meeting Tommy, learning about your connection to Elise Weber. It's like the past is reaching out, offering a chance to make things right." "You can't save your brother by saving mine," Sarah said gently. "I know," Richard acknowledged, "but perhaps I can save something of myself." The day Tommy turned 18 months old, the Wilsons hosted a small celebration in their fully renovated apartment. The space was unrecognizable, airy and bright, with specialized air filtration, soundproofed rooms for Tommy's sensitive hearing, and a small library nook for Emma filled with books in both English and German. Richard arrived early, carrying a wrapped package. In the 6 months since Tommy's hospitalization, his relationship with the Wilson family had evolved into something none of them could have predicted. He visited several times weekly, often bringing Margaret along. The two had suspended their divorce proceedings, instead attending counseling together, a suggestion from Emma that had initially annoyed Richard, but which he now valued. Right on time, Sarah greeted him, taking his coat. She looked healthier than he'd ever seen her, the perpetual worry lines on her forehead finally fading. With Richard's encouragement, she had returned to college to finish her nursing degree, with a scholarship from the Blackwell Foundation covering all expenses. "Where's the guest of honor?" Richard asked. "In the playroom with Emma. They're having a tea party." Sarah smiled. "Tommy's vocabulary is expanding daily. He said rich yesterday." Richard felt a surprising warmth at this news. Better than Mr. Blackwell, I suppose. Dr. Carter and Margaret arrived next, followed by Mrs. Petrovich from the old apartment building. Richard's security team did a final check before admitting the last guest, Henry Thompson. After their boardroom confrontation, Richard had expected to never speak to Henry again. But Emma, upon learning of the situation, had insisted on inviting him. "Grown-ups should forgive each other," she'd declared with 8-year-old wisdom, "like in my story about the 2 Tommies." Richard had relented, and to his surprise, Henry had accepted and subsequently made amends. The two now maintained a cautious professional respect. "Speech time," Emma announced after cake had been served. "Tommy and I prepared something special." She stood in the center of the living room, holding Tommy's hand to steady him as he wobbled on newly walking legs. The baby wore a shirt that read, "I'm 18 months old today," in bold letters. "First," Emma said solemnly, "Tommy and I want to thank everyone for helping us when we were in trouble, especially Mr. Blackwell and Mrs. Blackwell." "Rich!" Tommy echoed, pointing at Richard, who couldn't suppress a smile. "And we have a special announcement," Emma continued. "Yesterday, Mr. Blackwell asked if he and Mrs. Blackwell could be our godparents, and Mommy said yes." There were smiles and applause. Richard had discussed the arrangement with Sarah weeks ago. It wasn't adoption. Sarah was adamant about maintaining her independence, but it was a formal relationship that would ensure the children always had protection and support. After the small party dispersed, Richard remained behind, helping Sarah clean up, while Emma put Tommy down for his nap. "I have something for you," Richard said, handing Sarah the package he'd brought. She unwrapped it to find a leather-bound book titled The 2 Tommies, beautifully illustrated and professionally printed. "Emma's story?" Richard nodded. "The first publication of Blackwell children's books, a new division focusing on diverse voices and multilingual content." Sarah ran her fingers over the cover. "She'll be thrilled." She looked up at Richard. "And what about the 27 million? Richard had insisted on honoring his original offer despite Sarah's protests. The money was now in a complex trust for the children, with a separate fund providing for their immediate needs. "The trust is secure," Richard assured her. "Emma will have access to her portion for education at 18 and full control at 25. Tommy's is similarly structured." Sarah set the book aside. "You know it was never about the money." "I know," Richard acknowledged, "but a promise is a promise." They moved to the balcony, looking out over Boston as the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "Did you ever imagine, that night at the gala, that we'd end up here?" Sarah asked. Richard shook his head. "I was a different person then, harder, colder. And now?" Richard considered the question. The past 6 months had transformed him in ways he was still discovering. His board of directors complained he'd gone soft, but Blackwell Enterprises was more profitable than ever. His reconciliation with Margaret wasn't perfect, but it was genuine. And his connection to Emma and Tommy gave him something his wealth never had, a sense of purpose beyond himself. "Now," he said finally, "I'm someone who remembers what matters." From inside came the sound of Emma's voice, singing a German lullaby to Tommy. The same lullaby Elise Weber had once sung to comfort a frightened boy named Richard and his little brother Tommy many years ago. In that moment, Richard Blackwell understood what Emma had known all along. Sometimes the greatest wealth comes in the smallest packages, and sometimes what we need most isn't what we think we want. The story had come full circle. Not through millions of dollars, but through the innocent wisdom of a child who spoke truth to power in a language of the heart.